Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this distinguished public lecture. I've just recently joined the RSIS, and my job today is relatively simple. It's to be your host and the moderator for the discussion that follows. We're delighted to have Professor Christopher Hughes with us today as our distinguished guest. As you know, he's an expert in Japanese studies at the Warwick University in the UK, and he's our NTUC distinguished visitor as well. So delighted that he's spending some time here to help us figure out all that's going on in the world today. You only have to look at the developments that are taking place in Munich and in Paris, the sense of dismay and disarray that our governments are in, given the recent developments, to know that we're living in very bewildering times. The previous approach to global affairs with a dominant power, which was benign and minded to look out for the global common interest, has been replaced with something quite different. Much more me first, much more mercantilist, much more might makes right. And this new approach seems to be applied to friend and foe alike, sometimes more with friend and foe as well. And it's something we're all having to get quite used to. And in bewildering times like this, it's good to have friends like Professor Hughes to come and help us make sense of all that's going on, help us figure out where this might be going and where it might apply to us in Asia as well. As it has been said, what plays out in Ukraine today might be in Asia tomorrow. So I've been having good conversations with Professor Hughes over the last few days, and he's going to tell us a little bit about Japan's unique role as a key partner in Asia, but also very much within the sights of this new era and Japan's grand strategy in the Trump 2.0 era. So without further ado, let me hand you over to Professor Hughes for his lecture, and then I will be back for a discussion thereafter when there'll be plenty of time for us to engage with him as well. So Professor Hughes, over to you.
Thank you very much, Warren, for the very kind introductory remarks. Thank you, everyone, for coming here today. I just want to thank RSIS for this tremendously kind and generous invitation that they've given me. I've been in Singapore about a week now. I've had a pretty full but very, very interesting program. I've been treated extremely well. And I've been just so impressed by all the people that I've met at RSIS, from senior fellows all the way down to many of the early career researchers and students, and it really is a unique institution. I think there's no one else like it in Asia with that kind of concentration of expertise in international relations and security, but also focus on Asia and possibly, I think it's a pretty unique institution globally as well. So it's really a privilege to spend some time here. So thank you very much again for the kind invitation. As Warren said, I'm going to, and hopefully as you've seen advertised, I'm going to talk on this topic of grand strategy in the era of Trump 2.0. I'll try to I've got some slides, but I'll try not to spend too long talking through them, but hopefully they will give us a good foundation for some arguments that I'm going to try and make about where Japan is heading in this new era. And I hope it will also create some foundation for questions and discussions afterwards, which I'm really looking forward to hearing from Warren, but also from yourselves, what you may feel about this topic. So, without further ado, I'll move into the talk. Yes, indeed, we are, believe it or not, it's only 28 days, I think, but we are 28 days already into the new Trump administration. And here you can see, certainly Japan realizes that there's a new Trump administration, because here we can see Prime Minister Ishiba, who is relatively new Prime Minister of Japan, started towards the end of 2024, and he paid a visit to see President Trump in the White House the week before last, I think, that's right. So he was the second major world leader to make it into see Donald Trump. And Japan, just like everybody else, and just in the way that Warren outlined, I think is trying to make sense of exactly what this new era of Trump means. Obviously, before Trump became president, there was a huge amount of speculation about what kind of presidency, what kind of administration, what kinds of strategy the United States would pursue, and whether the US would adhere to its own international, rules-based international order that the US had created in terms of security, economics, institutions, and so on and so forth. But I think already, even within that first 28 days, we are seeing quite sharply the contours of this new Trump administration, its approach emerging, and possibly not too surprising in terms of approach, but quite surprising in just how bold and radical it could be. So of course, we are seeing a very strong America First impulse. Interestingly, I think we're seeing this emergence of what you might call a doctrine of spheres of influence, where it seems to be that Trump is perhaps acknowledging that the world, maybe not so explicitly, but implicitly has become multipolar, and that the United States maybe does not want total hegemony anymore, but it would rather have hegemony in its own sphere of influence in the Americas. Perhaps Russia can have a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe at least. And then, of course, we don't quite know what the US is thinking about China at this stage. But all kinds of really surprising talk as well around, even the US is talking about territorial aggrandizement and perhaps acknowledging that Russia in Ukraine can do something similar. If the US is going to get involved in security, it seems to be wants to do it at arm's length in these regions in a rather offshore balancing type of way. The US seems to be abandoning many of its own norms and its own rule of law in terms of how it would like the international system to be run, but even domestically as well. So the rules-based international order looks rather precarious at the moment. Destroyed by its own creator, potentially. Obviously, as we've seen, already from Europe through to the Middle East, and probably we'll see the Indo-Pacific next as the US turns its attention to this region, those adversaries, but also allies, allies seem even more worried, actually, than adversaries at the moment. What is the future of the international order going to hold? And of course, Japan is no exception in terms of thinking about its grand strategy and how to weather this storm or perhaps potential sea change in US policy. So Japan under Abe Shinzo, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, under his administration from 2012 to 2020, which of course overlapped with the Trump administration, I think many people said that Japan under Trump 1.0 actually coped pretty well with US approach to its allies and to the international system. But nevertheless, Japan had to react. It put in place a number of changes to its grand strategy, which I think is still playing out today. But also, Japan tried to Trump-proof some of its international strategy in order to try and insulate itself from, I think they had an inkling that Trump might return one day. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at how that strategy is continuing to play out. Is Japan trying to play a similar kind of playbook in terms of dealing with Trump? And to look across a range of areas that I've listed there, all the way from security through to economics, and then some of Japan's key regions and partners it's interacting with. And then at the end, because this is a little bit speculative, it is early days yet, but then try to speculate a little bit about where Japan may be heading in terms of its grand strategy, and just how much leadership Japan can exercise in terms of trying to undergird and maybe compensate for a lack of US leadership in the rules-based international order. This is very much a strong rhetoric from Japan that it wants to support this system, and now, just like the Europeans may have to step up, well, Japan may have to step up as well. So we'll see where Japan can go. Okay, so I suppose if we're going to talk about grand strategy, we need to say a little bit about what it is, and also where it's heading, what its trajectory is. So this slide is it's quite busy. There's a lot on it. Don't worry, I'm not going to try and go through this slide in its entirety. But really what I'm trying to encapsulate in this slide, and we can pick up more detail later on if anyone's interested, but really what I'm trying to encapsulate in this slide is there has been a pretty major transformation, I would argue, in Japan's strategy over the last 2 decades or so. It's been coming for a long time, but I think what we've seen is a shift from what you may be familiar with, which is in many ways what's seen as Japan's sort of classic post-war grand strategy, which is known as the Yoshida Doctrine after Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru, who was Prime Minister in the 1950s and had to figure a way of navigating Japan out of its very, very difficult post-war circumstances of defeat and occupation and how to rejoin the international family of nations. And I think we've seen Japan gradually discard that and then under Abe adopt what I think we can call a new Abe Doctrine. And this chart tries to summarize some of the main features of this new Abe Doctrine. Again, I haven't got time to go for everything, but just to pick out a few key things. I think very much, as I said, the Yoshida Doctrine was born out of defeat and Japan having to accept that status as a defeated power and then see how it could then work its way and extricate itself from that position. I think the Abe Doctrine very much is rejecting that as an identity for Japan now. And really the argument from Abe is that Japan needs to stand up, needs to recognize itself as potentially a tier one or even a sort of proto-great power. It shouldn't be ashamed of its past anymore. That's the time for apologies is gone. And instead, Japan needs to really function as a key member of the international system and really punch its weight in the international system. And very noticeable is under the Yoshida Doctrine, it was all about expediency, really a lack of any talk about values. But under the Abe Doctrine, a lot of talk about so-called universal values, but also this idea of the rules-based international order and that Japan would be a key member and its strategy would be predicated on maintaining the status quo in the international system. And that rules-based international order, obviously in some contradistinction to how Japan perceived Chinese behavior. And also we saw Japan emerging not totally under Abe, but certainly one product of Abe was to accelerate this move for Japan to become a more capable military actor in its own right and to start to escape some of those post-war constraints, to try and become a much more prominent and capable US ally in the belief that if Japan had more to offer, then the US would take Japan more seriously and it would be more of an equal partnership and more leverage and influence over US strategy. And also within the region itself, a kind of shift from reliance on economic engagement, reliance on engagement of China as default Japanese positions, and instead acknowledging coexistence with China is very, very important, but actually China is a competitor, not just in security, but also in economic terms, and that if necessary, Japan should balance China in some way, and that should also involve a more overt international leadership role. And Japan articulated under the Abe Doctrine this idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific. So you can see quite a change in Japan's grand strategy from a very low-profile, minimalist, low-risk approach under Yoshida to a much more high-profile, higher-risk, more prominent, more daring grand strategy even under Abe. Now, of course, it wasn't all plain sailing under Abe. He's often, of course, tragically, he was assassinated in 2022, and he was an incredibly consequential post-war prime minister. But he wasn't always. His statecraft, also came with quite a few drawbacks and mistakes, many of which I've listed here. There were what you might call kind of blind spots, and in many ways, these failings of Japanese diplomacy were accentuated by the latter part of Abe's administration overlapping with Trump 1.0. So Abe wanted to pressure North Korea over its nuclear missile programs, the Japanese abductees, but of course Trump decided to engage Kim Jong-un, and that led to the collapse of Japan's policy of maximum pressure. Likewise, the Trump administration showed very little interest in stable South Korea-Japan ties, and in many ways that enabled I think both leaders in South Korea and Japan to dwell on issues of history and territory, and that led to a really, really destructive downward spiral of bilateral relationships. Japan-China relations under Abe trying to find an equilibrium proved very, very elusive. I think Abe exploited the general disinterest of the Trump administration in trying to counter Russia or pressure Russia in any way. Abe tried to exploit that in order to look at find a peace settlement with Russia over the disputed northern territories, and trying to actually, in many ways, try to detach Russia from its alignment with China. But of course, we see that was totally unsuccessful. 26 summits Abe held with President Putin, and it resulted in no progress in the territorial dispute. Lots to talk about universal values, but also lots of double standards in terms of the types of regimes that Japan was willing to engage with. And even Abe didn't always prove entirely effective in dealing with President Trump, despite his reputation as a sort of Trump whisperer. Japan still got sanctions from Trump. Japan, as part of the quid pro quo over trade frictions, was obliged to buy lots of military equipment from the United States. And even Trump, from time to time, mooted the idea of abandoning the US-Japan alliance because he saw it as very asymmetric and unequal and unfair. The US was taking all the risk, and Japan wasn't paying enough in order to support the US presence in Japan. So Abe stopped being Prime Minister in 2020. We had a short interlude of Prime Minister Suga, and then Kishida, who I'm sure many of you know, picked up Japanese strategy from there on. And I think he had new problems to deal with, obviously the invasion of Ukraine and the shockwaves that sent through the international system, and really got Japan thinking about the linkages between its own security in Asia and what was going on in the European continent, and that Japanese security and European security were now conjoined because of that threat. And of course, Kishida very famously at the Shangri-La dialogue in 2022 talked about, and I think Warren, you quoted this, that Ukraine today may be Asia tomorrow. So the implications were deep in terms of perhaps encouraging Chinese aggression against Taiwan or against Japan. Likewise, economic security became a big concern of Prime Minister Kishida. So he picked that up, and that was a very, very important innovation of his administration. And then I think, quite surprisingly, but actually Kishida pushed ahead very much and accelerated a lot of the defense priorities of the Abe administration through, in 2022, what so-called 3 national security documents, which consisted of a revised national security strategy, a new national defense program, and a defense build-up program, where famously Japan increased its defense budget to 2% of GDP and adopted counter-strike, so a new doctrine of being able to strike back at aggressors against Japan. So quite significant changes. Lots of Japanese support for the war in Ukraine in terms of non-lethal support and economic support. And also, Kishida was able to repair ties with South Korea, again, because the Biden administration helped that process as well, because it was very vested in its 2 main Northeast Asian allies trying to cooperate more capably. Oops, sorry. So that's if you like, that's where Japan's strategy had got to by the time we get to Trump 2.0. And you could argue that Japan had quite skillfully put itself in a pretty good situation in terms of its defense policy, its regional diplomacy, its ability to deal with the United States. But now we have Trump 2.0, so how will Japan cope with that? As you might expect, Japan's initial response was very much to try the Abe playbook, to try and reiterate what Abe did. So Abe was very quick when Trump first assumed the presidency to get into Trump Tower, showered Trump with praise, famously gave him a nice gold golf club, but also was able to present to Trump the idea of a strong leader domestically in Japan that Trump could respect. And so, you know, the talk is that he had some influence on Trump's wider strategic thinking. So again, the Japanese have been very quick to try and get in to see Trump, sending all kinds of different, key characters. Prime Minister, ex-Deputy Prime Minister Aso, who's very close to Abe, Akie, who's Aso's widow. And Ishiba was really keen to try and get in to see Trump before his inauguration, but didn't manage that. But nevertheless, as I said before, he managed to be the second international leader to get into the White House to see Trump, to try and establish that personal relationship. I think Ishiba's visit went well. But nevertheless, I think there's a kind of gnawing understanding in the back of Japanese policymakers' minds that whilst it was a cordial visit and things went pretty well, nevertheless, trouble is in store for relations with the United States, and real doubts about whether the US is witnessing what's going on in Munich Security Conference and other avenues of activity from the early Trump diplomacy, really how committed the United States is to this rules-based international order. I think Japan's prime impulse will always be to double down on its relationship with the United States as a foundation of its diplomacy and see if it can get more leverage and become more indispensable to the United States. But also, I think we're going to have to try, probably Japanese policymakers realize there's going to have to be some pretty busy diplomacy and some innovative diplomacy in order to try and work with other countries to create a little bit of leverage or leeway vis-a-vis the United States. So we're going to have to see some quite active leadership, hopefully, from Japan. Okay, so I think I may have... No, sorry. Given time, I'm going to try and move quite quickly through some of these key areas because I think we may get some questions around these. But just to quickly outline, I think, the sorts of areas that we're going to see some action in terms of the US-Japan alliance to start off with. I think we'll see lots of continuity in terms of Japan's defense policy. Most of that is welcomed by the United States in terms of things like counterstrike, being much more serious about its own defense. There have been lots of changes in the US-Japan alliance where you're seeing the integration of US-Japan capabilities in things like missile defense in space, counterstrike, and also integration of capabilities and tactics in terms of the defense of Japan's southwestern islands, the first island chain, of course, Taiwan, and then below into the South China Sea. So all of that will be highly welcomed by the Trump administration. In fact, Trump, when he saw Ishiba, he took credit for all this. He said, of course, you only do this because of, when I was president. So most of that will be welcomed, and US and Japan will be very keen to do that. But I think we're also going to see lots of new pressures coming from the Trump administration. So Japan is spending 2%, or it's trying to get to 2% of GDP on its defense budget. But that's going to be already proving challenging, but we know that the US expectation is for its allies to get to 3%, hopefully. And certainly key Trump administration officials have already said that that's their expectation for Japan. Maybe a bargaining tactic, but nevertheless, Japan is going to feel the pressure. There will be a new round of host nation support negotiations coming up in 2026. Japan sort of dodged a bullet last time round because the negotiations didn't conclude before Biden administration came in. But all the predictions are that the US would like to see a tripling of Japan's contribution to the costs of US bases in Japan, up to about $8 billion a year. And we'll see if that causes tensions in the alliance. And also, I think we're going to see another sort of Buy America type of move by the United States. In other words, why are you developing all your own indigenous defense equipment? That's a waste of effort. Why not buy from us? We both produce the best defense equipment. But of course, that really causes deep problems for Japan's own autonomous defense production capability. And of course, the US sells at a price. and often black boxes a lot of that technology. So I think the Japanese are very worried that they may be selling a lot of their autonomy to the United States if Bush pushes that line. There will also be implications, I think, for Japan's relationship with other US allies and partners. So Japan's security strategy has been based, of course, with the US-Japan alliance at the core, but it's been trying to develop a range of complementary and supplementary relationships with other US allies and partners in order to buttress that, but also to give Japan a few options outside reliance on the US-Japan alliance. And the Biden administration, of course, very much encouraged that process of minilateralism. But we'll see how that fares under Trump. Again, some of the noises coming out of the early meetings are that the US is in favor of some of these groupings, but we'll see actually if that's backed by real commitment and encouragement from the United States. I think the US is certainly going to be interested in maintaining the whole idea of an Indo-Pacific strategy. The US probably likes the idea of the Quad, I think, although probably it will strip away some of the broader areas that the Quad started getting into under Biden in terms of public health, climate change, natural disasters, and so on. And Trump administration says that it is committed to the US-Japan ROK trilateral frameworks. But again, that was a lot of effort poured in by Biden himself personally. And of course, we know that South Korea is rather lacking in leadership at the moment. So, and Ishiba himself is not domestically that strong in terms of his own political position. So there are questions about whether that trilateral cooperation really can persist under the Trump administration. So, we'll have to see really where Japan goes with these minilaterals. And one interesting development is that Ishiba himself has often talked about this idea of, when he was running for prime minister at least, of this idea of Asian-style NATO. And at the time, it was very much dismissed as a ridiculous idea that Asian countries had too many divisions, they weren't ready for collective security. I think it's still a rather far-off prospect, but certainly if the United States continually shows itself to be lacking in commitment to the region, then the Japanese idea may come back in some form. I wouldn't over-push this, but I think nevertheless Japan has planted something of a seed of an idea that might get some reception in the wider region. And then again, I think we're back to probably some quite difficult economic frictions between the US and Japan. I'm old enough to remember, back to the 1980s, where we had this terrible US-Japan trade friction. I don't think we're likely to see that again, but certainly I think that's probably in Trump's mind. I think that's where he gets this impression, going back to the 1980s, of just those, that certainly if you read his writings, that's where he talks about, that's where he really, that captures his imagination at the time that the trading system was unfair, the US was being ripped off, and of course at that time Japan was seen to be the prime culprit. You can already see some early tensions. You may be aware that Nippon Steel, a major steel producer in Japan, wanted to buy US steel, wanted to take it over. The Biden administration blocked that on grounds of national security, which seemed a bit dubious, but Trump has certainly taken back that decision. And then very surprisingly, when Ishiba went to the White House, he suddenly announced, Nippon Steel won't be buying US steel anymore. It'll be investing heavily in US steel. And at the time, nobody really knew where this came from, and actually it's been revealed that neither the bosses of US Steel nor Nippon Steel had any idea this was a plan, and it probably seems like Ishiba just sat there quietly, also not knowing that this was a plan at all. So I think Japan's going to face a lot of uncertainty. Of course, it's very worried about tariffs. When Foreign Minister Iwaya met Marco Rubio, I think it was yesterday or the day before. Again, he put in a request, so please could we be exempted from tariffs, please? We're a good ally. But I imagine Japan is going to get tariffs. And of course, what it's really worried about is not just steel and aluminium, but tariffs on autos, either coming from Japan or produced in Mexico and Canada, by Japanese companies. Japan's going to do its best to try and persuade Trump that relationship with Japan is too strong economically to jeopardize. Japan has been the number one investor in the United States over the last 5 years. Ishiba said we'll get this up to $1 trillion in total. 1 million US jobs depend on Japanese investments. At the AI, we were talking earlier, Warren, at the Japan's announcement of a big AI initiative. One of the AI entrepreneurs in the room was Masayoshi Son, who's the head of SoftBank, which is a Japanese company. Sometimes he has a rather difficult relationship with the Japanese government, but nevertheless, that's potentially a big Japanese investment. And Japan's going to buy more LNG from the United States. So it's going to do its very best to try and mitigate those trade tensions. But I think there's going to be, I think Japan will be lucky to escape some of these tariffs. And likewise, on regional economic cooperation, I think Japan really would like the United States to return as a big player to the region. Obviously, the US didn't join the TPP. Biden came up with IPEF instead. Japan was somewhat disappointed because it had no real trade liberalization element. But nevertheless, they saw it as Japan and the United States trying to create the rules of the game in the region and not leave it all to Chinese influence. But nevertheless, of course, I think we're going to see Trump abandon IPEF as a Biden legacy. And so Japan is going to have to find ways of pushing ahead with cooperation in free trade with other countries in the region, particularly probably through the CPTPP. Japan-China relations, I think, will be another very interesting area to watch, and how Japan deals with this relationship. Japan is probably going to come under pretty intense pressure from the United States in terms of decoupling from China, in terms of economic linkages, trade, technological linkages. Japan's probably quite well set to rebuff those types of pressures. And I think it would be highly reluctant to do that. Japan has pursued a policy of de-risking and trying to build supply chain sustainability for those items that it does depend on China with, but also indispensability by trying to get into the higher areas of technology, which means that it's very difficult for Japan to have pressure exerted upon it by China or any other power. And of course, Japan is just aware that China is just too important as an economic partner to give into that US pressure. But I expect tensions. Of course, the other big problem for Japan is around security tensions in Taiwan. Trump administration, exactly what it's going to do on Taiwan. I'd be very interested to, if anybody in this room really knows or can give a view. It's speaking more or less the same way as the Biden administration, but nevertheless, there seem to be some moves made where it may be rattling China's chain somewhat on Taiwan. But on the other hand, Trump in the past has made some quite unguarded comments about maybe the US can't do anything to defend Taiwan, and why would we bother? So I think it's really, the Japanese are extremely nervous about will the US commit to the defense of Taiwan? And of course, if the US will not commit to the defense of Taiwan, how does that undo the entire series of security guarantees in the region, and particularly, of course, to Japan, if the US is not seen to be a credible partner in security. That said, Japan is aware that it's got some leverage against the United States, and that China right now probably wants to have a better relationship with Japan, so it's less isolated in dealing with the US over issues of trade and so on. So we are seeing, very interestingly, we're seeing the Chinese reaching out to Japan and taking certain steps, like resuming marine imports of fish, marine products from Japan, visa-free travel, and very interestingly, removing a buoy positioned around the disputed Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, which is quite an interesting sort of mini concession by China. So it's reaching out. So we may see common ground between Japan and China. Japan and the Korean Peninsula, again, I've touched upon this, but I think relations were getting pretty good between Japan and the ROK. Now, I think they could be in jeopardy because of domestic problems in South Korea itself. But also, what if Trump decides that he would like to resume his bromance with Kim Jong-un? He pursues this wedge strategy, alleged wedge strategy, trying to improve relations with North Korea, maybe even recognize North Korea as a nuclear weapons state in return for a deal whereby North Korea will detach itself from Russia and maybe from China to some extent. That probably seems a bit unrealistic to me. But nevertheless, this is going to cause ructions, and it's going to make the Japanese very nervous, again, that this is potential abandonment of Japan in the face of quite sort of unpredictable US strategy. And then the free and open Indo-Pacific. This is going to be a really key area, I think, for Japan's broader regional strategy, and how is it going to respond to Trump 2.0. The US is, again, saying some of the right things. It seems to be it's using the language of free and open Indo-Pacific. That language was used in the Trump-Ishiba meeting. It was used in the Iwaya-Rubio meeting. Even I think Pete Hegseth used that language as well. But is the US really interested in the region other than as a military sphere of activity? The last Trump administration didn't show a great deal of interest in regional institutions or ASEAN too much. We've seen that IPEF is probably dead as a framework. And of course, the Japanese nervousness is that this is really, US is vacating the region again. This means expanding Chinese influence, and that really Japan is left to a large extent on its own to try and organize the region in the absence of China. So really it will be up to Japan, I think, to try and inject new dynamism into its concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific. Japan will do that through trying to double down on relations with ASEAN, and particularly with some key ASEAN maritime states because of Japan's interest in the security of the South China Sea. We've talked about the TPP and renewed Japanese efforts there. Japan will probably court India and see what it can do in order to try and engage India in the FOIP. And Japan does have, Kishida did announce what's often called the new plan for FOIP in 2023, which actually tried to give more substance into what Japan was going to do under FOIP, because the criticism was often it was more of a vision or a very loose kind of concept rather than anything that could actually build more regional cohesion. So Japan has this new plan around things like infrastructure and values and maritime security and so on. It kind of sunk without trace in 2023, but I think we'll see if Japan can rehabilitate that and try and pick up the mantle of regional leadership under the banner of FOIP. And very quickly, just a little bit about the last perhaps set of relationships outside the Indo-Pacific. If the US is not going to undergird the international system, the rules-based international order, then it falls probably to Japan and to the European Union, or certainly they would declare that they are big supporters of the rules-based international order. Under Trump 1.0, Japan sped up its relationships with Europe, so it signed the Economic Partnership Agreement, it signed the Strategic Partnership Agreement. So we'll probably see some moves to try and boost EU-Japan cooperation in all kinds of areas around economics and security. But of course, we know the EU right now is not in great shape either as an actor. It's lacking leadership. So we'll have to see how much mileage that really has as a relationship. And then with Russia and Ukraine, I think Japan's been a pretty staunch supporter of Ukraine. It does see it as a demonstrator, really as a kind of line in the sand about how committed the international order is to trying to maintain the rules-based, the international community is to trying to maintain the rules-based international order. And then if Russia can succeed, then of course this is really has deep implications for the rest of the world and Japan itself. I think Japan will try to continue to support Ukraine, but of course it will be very much dependent on what the Europeans do and what the United States does. And we'll see if really Japan can keep up support if the United States withdraws support for the Europeans. Will Japan do anything more than just provide non-lethal aid and economic aid? Can it actually try to step up a bit more in trying to support Ukraine? Okay, so I think my time is just about up. So just some quick conclusions. I think they're probably fairly obvious from what I've said, but Trump 2.0 is probably going to be more challenging to Japan than 1.0. First time round, Japan feels it did a pretty good job, but partly was helped by the ineptitude of Trump administration itself. But this time round, Trump looks pretty much bent on trying to achieve that agenda fast and deep. So we'll see if Japan can cope with that. Japan's going to have to do more in the alliance, obviously. It's going to have to do more individually as an international player. It's got some leverage. It is important. I think there's some confidence in Japan that if the real object of US international strategy is to deal with China, then it can't do that without support from Japan. And likewise, China's going to need some assistance perhaps from Japan in dealing with the United States. So it does sit in it's sandwiched between the United States and China, but on the other hand, that can possibly provide some leverage for Japan. So lots of opportunities for Japan also to live up to its rhetoric about the rules-based international order, and particularly through, I think, FOIP as a vehicle for that. It does have convening power. It is trusted in the region. It's good at coalition building, so it has agency. And it has good relations with lots of US allies and partners. Japan also is very aware of the global south, and it really wants to work with a range of nations, and I think takes those countries very seriously in terms of the agendas that it's interested in. It's been very consistent in trying to flag those up in other fora like the G7 and so on. So it does have some opportunities there. But also there are internal obstacles within Japan itself. Ishiba is leader of a minority government. He's not particularly popular at home. He's probably clinging on, but he has an upper house election in July. If the LDP doesn't do well, then he will probably be out, and Japan will be looking for a new leader again. And there are not too many obvious candidates to take over that have good foreign policy experience or strategic mind. So, Japan could be left drifting somewhat after next year. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Hughes. Professor Hughes has given us a very broad overview of developments in the last couple of years in Japan, and I think that the broad sweep is very useful as a backdrop. But you're both a keen watcher of the situation in Japan, but also watcher of what goes on in the rest of the world in international studies. And I thought before we get to the audience's questions, it might be useful to start with more general framing of the discussion in terms of what do you make of this new world where we've got a play for Greenland, for Gaza, for Panama. And in that sense, is there a grand strategy behind all of that? Or is it just floating of trial balloons to see where things land and then decide where we will go with it? In this new era of Trump 2.0, is there a grand strategy at all?
Should I respond? Well, thank you for the question. Yeah, I suppose short answer is I don't quite know, but let's speculate anyway. So it's a mix, isn't it? I think so. We know that Trump is quite a politician that operates on instinct, so he doesn't really have much grasp of policy or finer details, but he has some sense of where things are going and what opportunities might present themselves and how to exploit things. So I think he and some of the people around him are probably just throwing out, as we see, a lot of stuff out there. They know there's, I think the fundamental interest of the Trump administration is around economics, and they want to, as they see it, restore the US economy and restore balanced trade and to stop being ripped off by the rest of the world. And a lot of the security issues are kind of getting in the way. So I think what Trump is trying to do is trying to throw out as many ideas out there to see if he can quickly shut down some of these conflicts, get quick solutions, and see if then they can who will bite on these kinds of solutions. Now, they may not be the sorts of proposals that the US wants to make, but he's getting others to jump around and get themselves organised and try and take some action. So if you don't like the Gaza solution, what are you going to do? What are you going to do, guys, in the Middle East? If you don't like the Ukraine solution, what are the Europeans going to do? Get yourselves organised, come up with something else. So I think there's a kind of broad sense of we need to do something around getting ourselves out of these conflicts. We need to save our resources for dealing with the real issues around economics, and we can use any kind of means possible to try and coerce or encourage other allies and adversaries to get on board that agenda. So in that sense, it feels there's an element of tactics there to try and achieve some of Trump's instinct that really the business of the United States should be thinking about its economy and getting out of some of these entanglements, because he doesn't like wars, because he sees them as wasteful, and really, the real issues around dealing with Japan, US's economic situation. Beyond that, I wonder, and again, I don't know that, I don't know this for sure, and others may know this, but beyond that, I wonder within Trump's team, those around him and those who are more experienced in foreign policy, whether there is some shaping up of a sort of a Trump doctrine, which is very much what you mentioned at the start and what I mentioned, which is this idea of a perception of the international system as no longer unipolar, or the US has no wish to have a unipolar system anymore. It wants to be top country. It wants to have primacy, but it doesn't want all the costs of hegemony that go with that, and it probably can't afford those anymore. And instead, it's reverting to multipolarity and is satisfied with that as long as there's a rough balance in the international system, or others leave the United States to its sphere of influence. So we seem to be regressing. I may be over-theorizing this or overthinking this, but we seem to be regressing to almost a kind of sort of 19th century, pre-World War I type of international system where it's about big powers. They have spheres of influence. They organise those spheres of influence so they're geopolitically close to them. You might have some influence over, further away as well. But the Americas are ours. China, well, you can probably have, parts of East Asia if you want, and Russia. You stick to where you are, but you can have Eastern Europe. I don't really care about that. And the Europeans, well, good luck to you, kind of thing. So I think there may be, again, I may be overthinking this. We'll see how much mileage this really has and how much energy this has. But there seems to be, beyond just the immediate tactics of Trump's instincts, let's get out of all these entanglements, let's get out of all these wars, let's focus on China and the economic problems of China. There does seem to be, perhaps there's a kind of deeper doctrine behind it, if I'm being charitable, because it's quite scary, but if I'm being sort of trying to rationalise it, maybe there is a different way of thinking about the international system that the US is starting to articulate. And I think probably, Europeans and Japan, they probably need to face up to this, and that maybe the US is not going to spring back to where it was before.
I think you mentioned in your conclusion that this provides Japan with some opportunities and leverage, right, especially with regards to China. Maybe you can elaborate on that idea. And specifically, do you think it's more likely that Trump will decide he has to focus on China and therefore lean on Japan to help him to deal with that situation? And then what are the implications of that if he decides to go down that line for Taiwan and the Japan and the Taiwan Straits, which the Japanese obviously are concerned, as you say, nervous about as well?
Yeah. So everything seems to indicate that, the real concern is indeed China. That's what the United States is worried about. Russia's a problem, but it's fine as long as they just stick to their own sphere of influence and don't get too close to helping China. Then they can just do their own thing. The Europeans can look after themselves. So I think the real concern is China. That's the real threat to the United States economically, and potentially in terms of its militarily as well. And maybe China doesn't want to stay within its sphere of influence, and actually it wants to. Again, if you talk to some of the more, maybe some of them, or read some of the views of some of the more
extreme people around Trump. It's bent on its own regional or potentially kind of displacing the United States as the number one state in the system. So yeah, China is a problem. So US needs to get itself out of all these other complications and really be able to focus on China. And I think from the perspective towards Japan, I think very much the idea is, Japan is going to help us. It's in Japan's interest to help us to put pressure on China, and that's in a sense that's Japanese responsibility, and we expect Japan to step up and to help us both militarily, but also economically. So I think Japan is going to come under quite a lot of pressure from the United States to do that. In terms of Taiwan, again, I find it very hard to read exactly what the Trump administration is thinking about Taiwan, but I'm getting the sense that they see it as a tool of leverage on the regime in China. So they're not readily going to abandon it, and they may use it as a way of cranking up the pressure on China. Though again, I don't think they want a conflict over it, but I think they see it as an irritant and a sort of bargaining tool with China to get China to give the United States concessions. So from the Japanese perspective, I think it's really worrying because they just cannot. I think they cannot read what the US intentions are. Japan wants the status quo. The US says it wants the status quo, but I think they feel that maybe the US will play fast and loose with that status quo, and inevitably Japan may become embroiled in that kind of conflict. Now, Japan may accept, well, we have to do that. That's the price of the alliance. That's for our own security. But I think they would like the United States to have very, very measured and strategic approach, and to bring its ally into understanding what it's trying to do, rather than playing the strategic ambiguity, that's fine, but that's supposed to be to some extent towards your adversary, not your ally who is increasingly invested in trying to support the US strategy in the region.
Okay. Before I'm going to go to questions from the audience, so please raise your hands and we'll get a mic to you. But one question before I do that is, you mentioned the role of Abe as the Trump whisperer. And I think one challenge we face now is there is no leader who can play that equivalent role, a strong leader who has his trust, that bromance, right? I mean, Ishiba doesn't seem to be the same kind of personality. You look at Macron, Olaf, Starmer, perhaps the closest is Modi in India. But do you see someone like that emerging who can manage Trump's instincts?
I tend to agree. I'm not sure Abe was such a great Trump whisperer anyway, but he wasn't bad. I mean, he did his best. So certainly he had some respect from Trump, but Trump tended to do things anyway. But Ishiba is not that kind of person, I think. Ishiba is, he relies very much on he thinks he relies anyway on very sort of patient explanation of issues, very long-winded. Trump doesn't have that kind of, he's just not like that, right? He wants kind of instant answers and so on. So, and likewise, I think in Europe, yes, we're short of Trump whisperers or people who have a good relationship with Trump. I think the UK would, again, I'm not really sure if it's realistic, but the UK would like to see itself. This is the kind of talk that's coming out of the UK at the moment, post Munich, as a bridge between Europe and the United States, and that Prime Minister Keir Starmer feels that he's got not a bad relationship at the moment with Trump, and Trump's very complimentary about him, despite him being a Labour Prime Minister. And Starmer is going over to see Trump sometime early next month, I think. So maybe he has some luck. The other person in the UK who's supposed to be a Trump whisperer is Nigel Farage, who's the leader of the Reform Party, who you may have heard of. But I'm not sure he's a Trump whisperer, or really he's just a collaborator, I think. So,
thank you. I see a hand over here. Could we get a mic? And please could you just tell us who you are and where you're from, and then tell us your question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Terence Lee. I'm a senior fellow at RSIS. Just a quick comment to Warren's question about who could possibly do a bromance with Trump from the region. I see two possibilities. One is Prabowo Subianto. If you recall the video that was circulating around social media the moment Trump won, Prabowo was extremely effusive. And of course, he has that strongman vibe about him. And of course, the other person is Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Bongbong Marcos Jr., also has that kind of vibe. Anyway, that's not my question. My question to you is actually to probe on what Warren mentioned a few moments ago and actually what you ended off on. Now, the Munich conference last week actually revealed something very starkly to Europe, and that is the United States is no longer a reliable partner, and the United States could actually be undermining the liberal international order or the rule-based international order, deliberately so. And of course, the defining moment is then now the key leaders of Europe are going to be meeting ahead of the summit and the meeting in Saudi Arabia to carve up Ukraine. For lack of a better word, it's the carving up of Ukraine. So essentially, Europe realizes that it has to do something to prop up this rules-based liberal international order. So in that vein, let me ask you right now, will Japan see a similar role? Because you begin your presentation by saying that Japan sees itself right now as a proto-great power, as a leader, right? And of course, Japan clearly identifies as one of these key nations in this liberal international order, together with Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, liberal democracies in this part of the world. Do you think Japan wants to play that leading role in upholding things like rules, practices, norms, things about free trade, multilateralism, territorial sovereignty, these kind of things? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Yes. I agree. As you know, Japan needs to really walk the walk as well as talk the talk in terms of the rules-based international order. I think it's serious. As I said, often there's some contradictions in Japan's behaviour. It doesn't always live up to its rhetoric and so on. But genuinely, whilst the instinct of Japanese policymakers is to try and invest more in the US-Japan alliance and see if it can influence the United States that way, I think they are really worried that the rules-based international order is in deep, deep peril. And Japan is fundamentally sees itself as a status quo power. It likes that system. It certainly doesn't like the alternative that might be out there of some kind of Chinese-centered regional order or global order. And in the past, it's shown evidence that it is willing to step up to some extent. So it's quite interesting when when Trump didn't refuse to sign CPTPP, Japan went ahead anyway with in Australia and other partners to put that into action. Obviously, hoping the US would come back to that at some point, but really seeing that as essential, because without that, then you're really going to the collapse of the regional trading system, or certainly any kind of managed order around it. So, and likewise, I think there are other areas. If you look at the Free and Open Indo-Pacific New Plan, which, again, as I said, didn't get a lot of publicity. A lot of people don't know about it. But if you go in and look at, there's quite a lot in there in terms of agendas that Japan is not just interested in, but other Asian states are clearly interested in as well. I think Japan's got a pretty good understanding of what needs to be done. I think Japan is willing to put a certain amount of its own economic resources into that. Of course, it has limitations on its own capacity. And I don't think Japan likes being an overt leader very much in the region, but I think it's willing to work through other partners that you've mentioned and through ASEAN to try and see what can be done. So I think the Japanese are realistic. They can't do it by themselves. It's going to be very, very difficult. I think they're pining for the days when they hope the United States will come back. You know, this may be just an aberration, but I think there is a dawning realization that this, as you said, this could be the future of the international system, and I think they're loath to just give up on it. It's far too dangerous for Japan, so they will try their very best to build coalitions to see what they can do to prop the system up.
What about organizations like the Quad? We haven't spoken much about the Quad.
Yeah, I think Quad is, again, that's something which Japan is quite vested in, and I think the Japanese were very pleased that when Abe would like to claim that he revitalized it, and that Trump was, keen to take part. I think Trump likes it because I think it's a sort of meeting of with India, other big powers. The US obviously has a big kind of driving role in it. So I think Japan was very gratified, and also I think Japan was pretty supportive that the Biden administration started to shift it onwards from just being, originally it was around exercises, maritime security and so on, and then they started to develop all these kind of working groups around climate change and health and infrastructure and cyber and all these kinds of things. So I think there's a good agenda there. I wonder whether some Japanese felt that perhaps it was becoming a bit diluted and possibly too much there wasn't really the capacity to do all these things. But certainly I think Japan will try to, and Trump is likely to dump, I think, a lot of those kinds of facets and really just focus on the maritime security. I think Japan will go along with that, but nevertheless, any kind of infrastructure, I think, any kind of frameworks for engaging the United States and getting the United States to sign on to this idea of free and open Indo-Pacific and some of those values, Japan is going to invest in those, I think. So yeah, so I think Quad is a useful one. I mean, the questions around AUKUS are interesting as well, but we might come to that. So.
Yeah. But before we leave that question from my colleague, maybe you could share a few thoughts about what's happening post-Munich, with the European leaders sort of rushing to get together and figure out financing, troops. How do you fill this vacuum that the Americans seem to be leaving with the talks already taking place today in Riyadh?
Wow, it's a difficult question, isn't it? I mean, I think the Europeans really are playing catch-up, aren't they? They're really surprised by the speed with which Trump administration moved. I think they thought Trump, the Trump gang were going to come over to Munich and they were going to berate them over defense spending and say, we're going to do something at some point on Ukraine. You guys need to get your act together. I've already had a chat. I'm having a chat with Putin. We're going to have talks next week. I've largely told Putin, what concessions I'll make. What are you going to do, guys? I think the Europeans have been completely flat-footed. So obviously they've had their summit, their sort of mini meeting. I detect some. I haven't really analysed it in depth, but I detect some unity of purpose in that they realise again they need to do something. They need to put something on the table. They need to have some suggestion to counter what the United States might come up with. I think there's some idea, as far as I know, certainly Britain says it's willing to put some boots on the ground in Ukraine. I think some other Nordic states, maybe I heard Spain, maybe France perhaps. Germany seems to be quite wary, but obviously got an election coming up. So they're groping towards something. They're trying to find something. But yeah, I haven't seen the news, but I think they're struggling. They really are struggling. But Europe is going to have to come up with something. That's the new reality. They are kind of part of Europe. We are on our own potentially. You might be able to persuade. I mean, it may be. The US may start to change its mind. It may find that Russia isn't so willing to. Putin might overplay his hand. Maybe it was all just preliminary talks, and actually they're going to bring the Ukrainians in more, and others will start to exert pressure, and the US will row back a bit. But I don't think there's any change from I think the reality is the United States isn't really going to want to commit. It's not going to commit troops. It wants to get out of that commitment to Ukraine as much as possible, and it's expecting the Europeans to fill the gap. But the Europeans are not organised. They're simply not organised. So.
Any other questions from the floor? This young gentleman, and then for Kwang.
Thank you for the lecture. So I'm Yong Sing, attending as a public audience. Yeah, so my question is, how do you think the Japan dynamics will shift if there's actually a change in the ruling party? So would the new ruling party continue to follow the APE doctrine where they focus a lot on counter-strike, or rather they focus on counter-strike, because I believe that was introduced so that Japan can somewhat be on an equal level with the US, so they wouldn't really abandon them. So if, let's say, if a new ruling party comes in and they were to abolish this, then perhaps we might see Trump doing something as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Great question. Thank you. Shall I respond to that one?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. So, yeah, elections are coming up in July. Probably the LDP, as I said before, probably won't do very well. I don't think we'll see I don't think we'll see the LDP lose power per se. We'll probably just see their majority cut in the upper house, so it just remains as a minority government. And the LDPs will cast around for coalition partners or partners that it can work with in a confidence and supply type arrangement, so to get them to, on particular issues, to cooperate. It's going to get difficult for Japan to have on a lot of issues, to have a lot of policy dynamism, I think. That said, around defence and security, whilst there are some, there are divisions in Japan, but I think the main parties that the LDP is likely to work with, so obviously the Komeito, its long-term coalition partner, but also partners like the Democratic People's Party, which did very well in last year's elections. They are quite, in terms of foreign policy, they're quite conservative, I think. So there's very little appetite, I think, in Japan for rowing back on the kinds of changes that have been made. So when Kishida announced his reforms around defence, counter-strike, very little public counter-reaction. Most of the main parties said, yeah, we kind of agree, or you should, to an extent, or you should do more, even. Really, the argument in Japan has been about how to pay for the defence expenditure increase. It would be through taxation or through more borrowing. So I think there's a pretty strong consensus within Japan that its international situation is not good with China, North Korea and Russia as neighbours. The United States is going to demand for Japan to do at least continue what it's doing, unless Japan doesn't want an alliance with the United States, in which case it's going to have to spend even more on defence. So I think when it comes to foreign policy, I mean, because it depends what the issues are, but I think in terms of what you can predict coming down the track, I think probably Japan will continue its position, even if the LDP becomes weaker. I suppose if Ishiba gets the boot, then it may make things even more confused, but we'll see.
I think for Kwang, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. Looking at Trump's first 28 days, it looks like he has a list of what he wants from every country. And it looks like it's going to be a very long list. So we have found out what he wants from Canada, from Mexico. He wants half of Ukraine's rare earth minerals. And we know his thoughts on Ukraine and Gaza. And many of his demands are, I suppose, you could say quite outlandish, right? So my question to you is, when he goes down that list and he comes to Japan, what would you imagine his top three demands from Japan would be? And please be as imaginative as possible.
Imaginative possible.
I don't think he'll be satisfied with US $8 billion from Japan for hosting the troops. I don't think Trump deals with single-digit demands. Thank you.
Right, okay.
Permission to be imaginative.
Yeah, imaginative. So on defence and security, I mean, the unimaginative thing is to say, yeah, more defence spending. I mean, I think the thing that Trump has mused about in the past is obviously once, short of Japan not doing more for the United States, or just have to pay more, and I think that will be the constant demand. But the one thing that Trump has always keeps saying is that the alliance is unequal. we can defend you, but you can't defend us. And of course, that's not actually strictly true because Japan has breached its ban on collective self-defense. So it can come to the defense of the United States in certain kinds of scenarios. But I think you will see just probably, again, just more and more demands from Japan to do much more detailed scenario planning with the United States of where it may actually commit to the support of the United States in certain kinds of contingencies. A lot of that's going on, but the Japanese are always trying to keep a certain amount of ambiguity so they don't get entrapped. So we may see more of that closer to closer military to military ties, as well as those demands for money. In the economic sphere, Trump can ask for it. Whether it can get it or not, I don't know. But it will certainly trying to balance the trade deficit more, and that may. Trump is now talking about not just formal tariff barriers, but barriers around sort of non-tariff barriers or things that make trade difficult. I think Japan's liberalised a lot, but we could be back in the days of the 80s and 90s when you had all these kind of very strange negotiations between Japan and the United States about structural impediments, if anybody's old enough to remember that, which really got nowhere because the Japanese just tied the Americans up in knots. But you may see more of that, everything's unfair, you need to liberalise this, you need to liberalise that. And we'll see where that goes. But I think the real quid pro quo will be, well, if you can't quickly balance out the trade deficit, well, you're going to have to buy more American equipment. So, more F-35s, more Ospreys, more, a huge shopping list. Maybe you can abandon your fighter plane program with the UK and Italy and just buy whatever the United States is going to produce next in terms of a fighter plane. I don't know, but those are them. That's kind of it being imagined. If you're sort of cranking up the possible, sort of height of US demands, those are the kinds of things I think the United States is going to demand. And then on China, I think will be very interesting to see where Trump administration policy goes on China, how coercive it becomes, and whether US tries to exert Japan on that sort of decoupling, which I talked about before, which I think Japan is really going to have to sort of resist, because it's fatal for the Japanese economy. As much as they want to diversify and move away from reliance on China, and they will do that. China, you cannot decouple from China. It's impossible for Japan to do that. So you could have some real tensions there.
Did you have something more imaginative in mind?
Yeah.
We haven't talked about this other theatre that we discussed this morning at a closed-door forum at RSIS about cybersecurity.
Right.
And there was a reference from one of the speakers to how Japan is 20 years behind its cybersecurity where it needs to be, and rapidly wanting to ramp up. Do you think that could be on Trump's wish list? Get up to speed on cybersecurity, invest in AI, work with us on that, keep the Chinese in the box?
Probably, yes. So, Japan has been, I think, behind on cybersecurity. Japan was often known as the hacker's heaven because it was so easy to just hack into government and private businesses and steal secrets. And of course, the Americans became extremely concerned about this because they were worried that some of the most sensitive technology was being, and software around defense was being shipped out by China out of Japan. So they put a lot of pressure on Japan to try and improve its regulations and laws and procedures around cybersecurity. Japan's made a lot of progress, and as we heard this morning, the LDP submitted a bill to the National Diet around active cyber defense, which now enables Japan to get around some of the constitutional prohibitions on being able to monitor private information flows, and therefore Japan can more proactively try to stop cyber attacks. So Japan is going that way. I think the US is, as we've seen with that whole big initiative around AI, and which looked like the US was going to sort of lock up AI, and then of course DeepSeek came along, and suddenly that's thrown everything up in the air. So the US is probably going to redouble its effort in AI, I imagine, as a kind of key frontier technology that it doesn't want to see dominance to China in. And it probably sees Japan as a partner in that. And in terms of the defense sector, AI is something the US and Japan are already working on through what's called the die-cast process. I can't remember exactly. It's a Defense Industrial Corporation process, which was launched a couple of years ago. But one of the areas they decided they would work on is AI, because Japan chose not to co-develop a fighter with the United States for various reasons, probably because the US didn't have anything to offer anyway. But AI was seen as a kind of alternative area that they could work on. And also there's AUKUS as well, which again we'll have to see how committed the United States is to that. But Pillar 2, Japan is potentially being invited to join that, and again AI is another big technology. So I think you're right. I think the United States will try to draw Japan increasingly into this big effort around AI and trying to deny China advantage in this area.
In the interest of being imaginative and maybe a little provocative, what about an alternative scenario where anything is possible these days, right? As we've seen over the last month, where Trump decides to do a big deal with his great pal in Beijing, Xi Jinping instead, and says, I'm not too worried about Taiwan, why do we worry so much? Japan, you can look after that situation. I'm just going to strike a big deal with China. How will Japan react in that scenario?
Probably panic to start off with, but that is the kind of in the far recesses of Japanese policymakers' minds is always that.
We've seen it happen with the Europeans in Ukraine, right?
Yeah. I think the Japanese are aware very much that the US has a history of abandoning allies, even quite close ones. It's invested a lot in, so in a way it abandoned South Korea before the Korean War. It abandoned South Vietnam, abandoned Afghanistan. It depends how you want to interpret these or cast these, but nevertheless, I think Japan is aware that when allies no longer have utility for the United States, and then the US is prepared to walk away at times. So I think they're quite realistic. Now, they will do everything in their power to try and exert influence over the United States to stop that. Which is why the Japanese instinct is always to double down. Every time the alliance looks rocky, it's to go to, they say, we'll do more for you in the United States. We'll try and make ourselves more indispensable so you can't abandon us. But yeah, I mean, Trump is a kind of different quantity, isn't he? If he did try to do this grand bargain with Xi and say, here's your sphere of influence, you can have, forget, just don't cause too much trouble, but fine, we're off. Then Japan feels it's on its own. Then we are in this really kind of nightmare scenario for Japan, where it has to fend for itself. And there are different kinds of scenarios, which I think are a long, long way away, and I really wouldn't stress them too much. But one is, obviously Japan has to strengthen its own independent defence capabilities, but it will try to obviate that as much as possible by working with other partners like Australia and other quasi-allies that have capabilities, South Korea, Philippines, and so on, to see if that can help to fend off Chinese influence. But then, ultimately, if all of that doesn't work out, then Japan has to probably go down the route of its own nuclear deterrent in some form as the ultimate guarantee. But again, I think that would be anathema to most Japanese policymakers, most Japanese people, and that's the most desperate of kind of situations where really the US has gone from the region as a security guarantor or even an offshore balancer.
Okay. I saw some hands at the back come up. Please, the gentleman at the back.
Hi, Professor. My name is Michael from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you for your lecture. My question is about setting the theatre, which is closely linked to your presentation. And it's also premised on what you mentioned earlier about your suspicion that the world is reverting to a kind of 19th century global order. In that kind of order where you compete for spheres of influence, simplistically speaking, a great power would seek to strengthen its own sphere of influence and challenge other spheres of influence. Then in this logic, based on this logic in Asia, this would mean that there would be a contest for influence in Asia. And my question is essentially, what kind of contest in Asia plays to Japan's strengths? And I mean more than economics, because economic competition is definitely far, far better than military competition. So for example, would you say it's technology, robotics, infrastructure, aid, that kind of stuff? Thank you.
So yes, all of those things are strengths that Japan has. On the economic side, yes, of course, you can think about trade and markets and so on. But I think one of the things that Japan probably prides itself on is that it has if we're talking about some contest for influence in the region, what Japan has to offer is its identity or its presence as seen as a non-threatening. It has military capabilities, but it's limited in what it can do. And instead, it wants to approach some of these other issues through different means. And certainly that is where I think you're seeing Japan always trying to exercise leadership. And I talked a little bit about the idea of the global south, and that Japan is offering quite a distinctive type of leadership or cooperation with countries in the region that's very different from the US leadership, which has become increasingly based on military force and capabilities. It would like to see it's different from the Chinese conception of leadership, which is, as you've seen for the BRI, Japan at least likes to cast that as very top-down, again, very much trying to just play to China's agenda, and in many ways trapping countries within the region into dependence on China and debt and so on. That's the Japanese rhetoric. Whereas I think Japan would say, well, we're clearly different from the United States. We've got some security capabilities, but we're not. And we can work with others, and we will do more with other countries in the region. But we're clearly not the United States. On the other hand, we're not China. We're very much interested in a lot of trying to work in a genuinely collaborative sense. We're very much interested in those agendas of the global south, but China is as well. But we want to do it in a way that's not going to lead you into poor infrastructure, debt, or unsustainable kinds of development projects. So I think Japan does have a lot to offer in terms of that sort of know-how, and in terms of that general approach to development and trying to work on some of those kind of key agendas that the region has. So Japan can compete for influence to some extent through sort of militarily, through balancing with other countries, but a lot of what it's really good at is traditionally that focus on economic development and doing it in a way that is seen to promote the interests of the global south.
I think we have time for one last question. Who would like to ask the last question, or shall I? Please, the gentleman there.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My name is CK Ha. I'm a PhD student at the University of Cambridge and visiting at RSIS. In terms of Japan's grand strategy, you mentioned about the trajectory of beginning from Yoshida Doctrine, now big revamp during the Abe administration, and Kishida somewhat following that trend. But do you see, given Ishiba's weak domestic political stance, and given how the oppositions are increasing their influence in Japanese domestic politics, do you see any glimpse of perhaps Japan returning back to more closer Yoshida Doctrine line than becoming a greater Japan as Abe has put forward?
Short answer is no. But I mean, I think you're right. There is still an impulse in Japan. There's still some ambivalence around moving away from those old certainties of the Yoshida Doctrine, that sort of low profile, trying to rely as much as possible on economic means and trying to relegate military means to as far as possible down the agenda, and yes, being allied with the United States, but really trying to do a minimalist, as little as possible and get into as little trouble as possible in terms of working with the United States. So, I mean, I wouldn't dismiss all of those things as still exercising the minds of Japanese policymakers, but I do think there's been a fundamental shift in mindset in Japan. I think the public is catching up to some extent. I mean, policymakers really do see, I don't think they're just saying this, I mean, they really think the international system has shifted. The United States is relatively less capable, relatively less committed. Japan's response to that is to invest and try and shore up that hegemony, but they know it's precarious, and they know they have to do more. And the sort of, if you look at national security strategies and so on, and the kind of the sort of slogans have been, the first one was very much about no country can defend itself anymore by itself, apart from the United States, of course, right? So in other words, we have to work collectively. We can't just retreat into our shell. That's just not possible. The international system, military technology, we are just exposed and vulnerable, and we have to get out there and do more. And then the latest one was very much about fundamentally reinforcing defence capability. So not only do we have to do more, but we have to do more in terms of our own military power, because the neighbourhood and the international system is just so hostile. And you know, Japan talks about itself as a frontline state. It talks about, you know, China as an unprecedented challenge. The security situation is the worst since the end of the Cold War. So some of that's rhetoric, I know, but I think it does, and some of it's appealing to the Japanese public and so on, to try and heighten those perceptions. But I do think actually, again, if you just track what Japanese policymakers have been saying, no one's really talking about kind of Yoshida Doctrine anymore. That's not an option. Yeah, we've got to move on. We've got to break it gently to the Japanese public, but we're moving on, you know. And again, just Trump is just fueling that perception. We've got to do more.
So back to the future strategy is not part of the grand plan.
I don't think so. No, back to sort of isolationism or sort of, you know, Tokugawa isolation. I don't think you hide away from these problems. I don't think anybody really sees that as a feasible grand strategy anymore.
Okay. Thank you. I'm sure you'll all agree with me that Professor Hughes has given us a lot of insights into the situation, and we'll all be watching developments for the next few months and years as we go ahead in this new era. So could you please join me in thanking him for the lecture as well as the...
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you.